One of the most common concerns I hear from painters is that they just don't understand composition. They worry that they might be breaking the rule of thirds, or they have their subject centered in the canvas too often, or their painting is leading the viewer's eye right off the edge of the canvas. These concerns make sense because many artists aren't painting the compositions that actually excite them or impress them. Maybe they really love emotive portraits that have these complex narrative structures, but what they paint most of the time are headshots from sketchy or smiley, awkwardly lit iPhone candids of their grandkids. But most painters get stuck on composition because they think they have to go off and memorize a ton of abstract, abstruse rules to solve this problem. But the most helpful exercise that I have found is way simpler than that, and that is what I'm here to walk you through today. Today, I'm going to use the kind of paintings that I am drawn to as an example, but I have helped hundreds of artists to work through this exact issue, and this is exactly what I love geeking out about and diving into. So if you are working on taking your paintings to the next level and composition has been keeping you feeling stuck and frustrated, I would love to help. There's a link below in the description to find out exactly how it works, and to go ahead and book a free call to speak directly with me about this. So let's go ahead and dive right in with some actual real-life examples of the kinds of paintings that you might be drawn to and what it looks like for us to really start to deconstruct their compositional elements. And I'm going to go ahead and begin with portraits. After all, you all know me first and foremost as a portrait painter, and you have a lot of context for what my kind of portraiture looks like and what I'm drawn to. So chances are, if you're following my channel, portraits are probably going to be near and dear to your heart as well. All right, so here I have one of my Pinterest boards that is dedicated to helping me identify what my inspiration for my compositions should really look like. I put this together using the steps from my previous YouTube video on how to create a vision board or an inspiration board for your oil paintings. I'll link that above just in case you would like to go through this exercise for yourself. I find it is incredibly helpful as a jumping off point for what we're going to be discussing today. So taking a look at the vision board that I have here, I am focused very specifically on portraiture in this section, which makes sense. All of these are paintings of people first and foremost, and most of them are cropped into about head and shoulders. They're featuring much more of like the individual person rather than thinking of the entire figure or that person kind of as like a stand-in for potentially anybody. So, one thing that I am noticing right off the bat when I take a look at my vision board here is that I really don't have a strong emphasis on backgrounds in any of these paintings that I'm drawn to. All of these paintings, just to give you some context, are the pieces, the portraits in particular, that most inspire me. If I could paint a portrait and it happened to look like it could belong with this collection of work, that tells me I have really achieved my goals. And so I haven't put any portraits on here that don't represent what I am drawn to. This is a really helpful jumping off point or foundation for the rest of this conversation. So starting from a place of really knowing what the work you want to make looks like is incredibly helpful, and looking at the work of others that really inspires you is a huge component of that. You can also include paintings that you have made that happen to be ones that you're really proud of or that really impress you or that are inspiring you to keep making more paintings like them. So that's just something that you can keep in mind as well. But for this conversation, I'm focusing primarily on art by other artists. So first thing I notice as I take a look at all of these paintings is that there really isn't a strong emphasis on a specific background. There are some exceptions here, like this gorgeous Alex Venezia painting. Obviously, in this example, we have a very high degree of realism throughout the entire image, and it's very clear what setting the subject is actually in. And this holds true for a couple of additional examples as well, but I'd say on the whole, when I take a look at this, the backgrounds are either empty or bare canvas, or they have been very simplified and you really just think of them as like a collection of brushwork more than anything else. This is what I really consistently see throughout these images. So in terms of me starting to compose my own portraits, this is something that I would consider. I don't need to put in a ton of effort into a highly specific background. But you might be wondering, what about something like the rule of thirds? Or what about, where to place the subject within the canvas? So let's go ahead and start to unpack that. Let's say, for example, that I want to use this Zorn painting as inspiration for one of my own images. Well, I don't think that it's necessary in this case to, bust out your protractor and start divvying this piece into the rule of thirds. Rather, we can actually break this down, I think, in much more straightforward terms. We can look at the background and say, okay, this background overall is going to be quite dark, nearly black. In fact, the darkest area of the background is going to hit right up against the lightest portion of the sitter's face. Now, for the part of the head or the part of the subject overall that happens to be in shadow, where the darks get very dark, you'll notice that the background actually lightens up just a little bit so that the subject can actually stand off of that background, which would struggle to do if it were juxtaposed against this really dark that we have further to the left here. If I were to set up my own painting and I wanted it to have a composition that mimics this one or takes inspiration from this one, what I would actually do is probably begin by trying to reverse engineer something very close to this image, and then start to branch off and give myself room to be genuinely creative and original, so I'm not just creating a work that's derivative of Zorn's painting here. So I might begin by taking a friend of mine who has incredible facial hair, maybe making sure that they are dressed in a three-piece suit and posing them with lighting that is meant to come from an angle, so I have essentially 3/4 of the face in light, and I would keep that light really hard so I have a very distinctive shadow pattern that falls on the far edge of the face, the one that is away from the light. This sounds pretty straightforward. In practice, it can take a little while to get used to setting up a model in this way and starting to get really intentional with things like your costuming or your lighting setup, or how to make sure that you have lighting that gives you these nice, strong edges or really, truly deep, rich darks. That being said, it doesn't have to be overly difficult. So as a general rule, not to get too much into the nitty-gritty here, but if you do have a portable light, something cheap that you can get off Amazon, you can set that up in your studio and you can get a light that, one, allows you to control the temperature of that light, so you can decide if you want a subject that's going to be a little bit warmer, or you can make sure that you keep your subject a little bit cooler. You can also choose to use something like a diffuser on top of that light to soften the light and give it a little bit more of a hazy lighting scheme. I think this Richard Schmidt example is a great example of that in action, where we really don't have very stark shadow shapes within the figures here. This is very overcast in its feeling, and you can simulate that with your own studio lights by using something like a diffuser screen, or even like a white shower curtain that you hang over your light. But if you take something like that away, you tend to get much harder edges. Similarly, if you're looking to get really rich darks in your shadows, that can really be helped by controlling the amount of white objects that light can bounce off of in your studio to go back into the subject's face. So making sure that you actually have almost black backdrops all around the subject can help to really make sure that your darks truly are dark. So this would be just a jumping off point for portraiture. I think the final piece that I haven't really covered here is the posing of the model. So one thing that I think is really striking about this image is that we do have this kind of curving gesture that runs through the painting. Now, there are absolutely different ways to break something like this down or interpret the overall gesture. We could look at this curve that goes from the head down the upper and then lower arm on the left-hand side. We can look at the midline of the gesture of the body and There are artists out there who are so used to doing this that they probably see things that I don't. But you do not have to be a highly practiced master to be able to set up a composition that sets you up for all the success you genuinely need. So for instance, having your subject sit down and getting not just their face at this 3/4 angle, but posing their body at the same angle, making sure that you're mindful of the angle and positioning of both arms so you get something like this nice arc in terms of the negative space of your painting, being mindful of something like the dominant hand, the hand that is closer to the painter, the viewer, and making sure that hand has an interesting pose, making sure that it is standing off of a darker part of the subject's clothing so the hand really does have some contrast that draws the eye to it. Having something like a cigar or an interesting ring on the sitter's hand to add additional visual interest to the composition. These are all things worth considering. And if you were to begin by trying to reverse engineer a painting like this with these kinds of factors in mind, you are already going to see a huge leap forward from those iPhone candids or those headshots that you get off of drawing apps. And instead, you should start to see that actually you're really set up for success in a way that you probably haven't been in your paintings regularly up until now. And then to continue to make a painting like this one your own, you can begin to experiment with the pose. You can actually put away an image like this one and take it out of your mind and start to experiment with slightly different variations in your setup. Maybe you go from an image like this one to one where you have the subject bring their hands together, or you explore slightly different angles of the body or the head, or you actually move your light around until you find the lighting that is genuinely most interesting for you and for your composition. In my students, I like to think of this as a series of baby steps. So one of the first things I will often ask them to do when they're interested in replicating a painting's composition and bringing that into their own work in a very consistent way is I might actually have them start by trying to reverse engineer one of their favorite paintings as faithfully as they can, of course, with their own reference. So they might have a completely different sitter, but they might choose somebody to sit for the painting who bears some resemblance to the original sitter. They might choose them for the color of their hair or the kind of ensemble they are wearing or the sitter's gender. And then again, try to be mindful of things like hair choice, makeup choice, costuming, props, and try to replicate that painting as much as possible. And once they find that they really are able to set up a painting that has the same kind of intentionality with the posing, with the lighting, with the props, with the costuming, with maybe narrative or emotional components to the piece, then we start to have them move away just in baby steps until the pieces that they are creating are entirely new and entirely original, but they still capture some kind of essence of the original artwork that the painter was inspired by. So now that we have taken a look at what this looks like in practice with something like portraiture, let's now turn to something like landscapes. I think oftentimes this is where compositional rules really jump to the forefront, and painters start to get really concerned with compositional rules when we are talking about landscape painting. So here I have just a few landscape images that I have penned from some of my favorite artists, many of them who are working today and producing absolutely stunning work. One thing that really strikes me when I look at all of my inspiration here in one place with regard to landscapes is just how common it is for me to be focused on either cloudscapes or water as the key aspect of the painting. So I don't have a lot of mountains on here, I don't have a lot of desert scenes, but I do see really sweeping skies, and I do see an emphasis on highly reflective water. over and over on this inspiration board. This is really useful because before I start to get into trying to unpack kind of abstract, difficult to decipher rules about where to place certain objects on the canvas, or things like the rule of thirds, or making sure that you don't have a line that draws the viewer's eye totally off the canvas. Instead, I really want to start with something that is more basic. What kind of landscapes am I really looking for? And what this really tells me when I take a look at these paintings on the whole is that I need to be waiting for very specific circumstances before I go out and paint. Now, that's not to say that I couldn't paint anything as a fun exercise, but when it comes to being really intentional with my composition, I want to make sure I'm being intentional about the subject that I'm choosing. So what this probably looks like, based on the board that I have here, would be things like, going out to the beach and painting on a day where I have really beautiful clouds and I see a lot of that reflected in the water, and that the water is still enough that I will capture a lot of those reflections. Now, the beach isn't the only place where this is relevant. Taking a look at this gorgeous, expressive Gordon Allen landscape here, one thing that I'm really struck by is how much of the sunset here has been captured in this creek. We see so much of the color and the impasto echoed here. And what this tells me, again, is that I need to look for water that is still enough, and I need to look for a sky that is probably capturing really interesting color. So once I have a clear idea of what kind of subject I really want to focus on, one way that I can really effectively understand the compositional structure of the painting is actually to do a little bit of house cleaning here. And restructure the board so that I have similar compositions next to similar compositions, and I can start to appreciate what the trends really look like. For instance, I have these 3 paintings here, all of which have a really big sweeping sky that represents probably about 2/3 of the painting on average. Of course, they kind of differ across these 3 compositions, but we have these cloudscapes that make up the bulk of the painting. You could probably argue that this one is a little bit different. It just doesn't read the same way, but you'll notice that the image is broken up in very similar terms, even though we might not be looking at the same kind of cloudscape here. Essentially, we have like this large rectangle on top and a smaller rectangle on the bottom, and that is the overall composition that we would be adhering to. So what I can do is I can actually run with this, and I can put paintings that have this overall structure next to one another as near as possible. And I can also do this with paintings that have like these beautiful arcs that are breaking them down and running through them until I start to notice what the trends really look like. What is the shape that the viewer's eye takes as it's guided through the canvas? Now, this is something that does take some time and take some practice, but, for instance, if I'm taking a look at this gorgeous Kathleen Hudson landscape here, and I notice that a lot of her paintings that I'm drawn to have this sort of serpentine pattern of a road cutting through the image, and I happen to be out and about and I see a dirt path that has this beautiful arcing road that then crests a hill and disappears, then comes back up later, across the horizon, that tells me that that's probably a composition that I'm going to respond to and that I can go ahead and embark on painting. So if I were to give myself a homework assignment, now that I see all these landscape paintings in one place, in order for me to really be able to capture these kind of compositions in my own work, I would probably take a pretty similar approach to the one that I described when I was breaking down the portraiture. To begin, what this would look like is I would first reorganize this board so I could really start to see what the overall compositional patterns look like. I'm going to go ahead and do that now. All right, I've gone ahead and just kind of quickly and roughly reordered some of these images that we can start to see, hopefully a little bit more clearly, what some of the trends look like. So up in the upper left-hand corner of this board, I have a lot of these images that have, I would say, a very sort of rectangular feeling composition to them, where I have a clear and visible horizon line that cuts straight across the image, or at least very close to that. I have a lot that happen around the 2/3 or maybe 3/4 mark. One that actually inverts that and has a little sliver of sky up top, and then a very chunky horizontal block of landscape below. This image is of a painting that's taken from the side, but I can tell that once it's actually straightened up to the camera, it would also have that very strong horizontal feeling. Then I break into some seascapes that are a little bit more focused on the reflective aspect of them. There is a very clear horizon line on these images. Again, I would say that horizon line often comes at about the 2/3 mark on the image. And then in the upper right-hand corner, I have a number of cloudscapes where I have just a little bit of shoreline. Almost all of these are beach scenes. These are taken as if they are photographs. These are all painted around sunset or potentially sunrise, depending on what coast you happen to be on. And they definitely have the vivid color to show for it. The sun is also visible in just about all of these images. And then the next two categories are a little bit difficult to see grouped together because Pinterest can be stubborn when it comes to allowing you to organize images next to one another. But I've gone ahead and, as best as I could, tried to capture paintings that have these sort of arcing lines running through them, whether this is because of a road, because of a river, because of a shoreline, because of a coastline. This is actually a kind of interesting one because I do have that, that strong horizontal, and then rather than having like a very dominant arc running through the image, I kind of have this little squiggle running through the image, and then I have something kind of similar happening up here in the painting next to it. And then the final category is images that are more overcast cloudscapes. You'll notice a lot of these paintings toward the bottom of this Pinterest board have this kind of champagne or gray coloring to them. We don't have the sun visible, but we can absolutely see the effect of sunlight on these images. They're often beach scenes once again, but very different from these sunset beach scenes that we see here. So with this in mind, what I can actually go out and do is I can start thinking about when and where I will have access to these kinds of scenes, and I can start planning to actually be here at the right time to capture images like these. I can plan on going out to the beach, and depending on the weather, try and capture something a little bit more overcast, like the images that I have down below. I can be really intentional about capturing something like the sunset or the sunrise. I can also, I can be really intentional with looking out for these compositions where I have these sort of swooping arcs of creeks or rivers or roads that cut through the composition and create that kind of arc. And in doing so, we obviously have less control than we do in the portrait studio. However, let's think of this as just taking photographs right now versus going out and trying to paint plein air. If I were to just think about the exercise of looking for and capturing the kind of composition I'm interested in, and for the time being, I'm just doing that with my camera, what I can do is I can go out and I can really intentionally go and take a whole bunch of photos. I can find a really great scene and I can photograph it from as many different angles as I can. I can wait around and capture it under different lighting conditions and different times of day. And I can actually come back into the studio and compare this to paintings on my board. And I can even put photographs on the inspiration board just like this and compare them one-to-one with some of the images here to ask, does the composition of my reference really look like it belongs with the composition of the images that I'm already really inspired by? And if I were working on a studio painting versus a plein air painting, I could then go ahead and dive into that particular reference and that composition. Or if I now have that greater degree of understanding of what I'm looking for, I can keep that in mind next time I go out to paint, plein air, to paint outdoors, and start from this place where I'm painting something that I know sets me up for success because it looks very similar to what I'm drawn to. And over time, as I begin to develop a feel for what's really working, I will have to do this comparison less and less. One other way that you could think about this is if you happen to be drawn to a landscape painting that happens to be of a very specific landmark. Like, let's say I had images of the Grand Canyon appearing over and over on my board, or there's a particular monument or geographical phenomenon that I just see over and over, and I can actually pinpoint where that is and what time of year that painting was probably painted. I can actually go out to that site and I can think about, setting myself up where one of my favorite painters probably set up, and I can actually try to create a painting with that similar composition that I was really originally drawn to, and then over time move it further and further away, compositionally speaking. I find that for most painters, this is a much more immediate way to really start seeing the results that you want to see in your own paintings when it comes to composition, rather than having to do a ton of research and a ton of reading and finding a lot of rules that contradict one another, or finding certain rules that some artists swear by that you see other artists breaking all the time. I find that really trying to understand which rules to follow and which rules to break and when can be so overwhelming that it's almost crippling to a lot of artists. And this approach of simply studying what you are drawn to and then going out and at first trying to replicate it really closely so that you really understand what compositional elements you are looking to replicate, and then over time working your way just further and further away from that replica until you are creating something that's genuinely original but still captures the compositional elements that you love. I find that this yields much more immediate results and also a greater sense of understanding, not just of composition and what works or what can work, but the kind of composition that resonates best for you. I hope that this video has been really helpful in genuinely demystifying a lot of myths and confusion and overwhelm that can come with breaking down questions of composition. If this is something that you want help with, or that has been a significant struggle, or you have a sense of what kind of composition you're drawn to, but you're not sure how to actually start setting that up for yourself, and you want an expert artist to help guide you through that process, this is exactly what I do every day. It is what I love doing, and I would love to help you. To find out more about how that works, go ahead and check out the link in the description below, and go ahead and follow the link to book a call directly with me. Again, it's free, and I would love to chat with you so that we can help you to really create the kind of compositions that inspire you. Until then, if you do have any additional compositional questions, please let me know in the comments. If you're going to be at Portrait Society this weekend, please come by and say hello. And until next time, happy painting.